came to Jumble I think that I would standard told me not about
Larry Hancock.
Good morning, Larry. How are you?
I'm fine. Hello, Stuart.
Man, you're there, ready and waiting to talk
I'm here,
to us.
ready and waiting with lots of acronyms and special terms. And how did your weather improve today?
Not really. No, it's pretty awful.
Okay, happy I'm here.
It's St. George's Day, though.
Well, then it's bound to improve later on, right?
Yes. Okay, anyway, welcome, Larry. Thanks very much once again. It doesn't seem a year since we've spoken to you, but you've got a full, or must be about 28, 30 people here, eager to hear what you have to say to us. And I have warned them that questions will come sort of every 10, 15 minutes. So we'll do it like that. But anyway, welcome, Larry.
That's great, actually. I do wish I could be with you all in person. That would be fine. I'll try to do as best I can with this remotely. Just out of curiosity for my background, a lot of material in this presentation is excerpted from my most recent book, Surprise Attack. And I'm just curious if anyone among the attendees has read Surprise Attack or not. That will kind of help me know where I am.
I have read it. Well, I'm about halfway through, Larry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
I've got it, but I haven't read it yet.
And Barry's got it, but he hasn't read it yet.
It's okay. I'll go ahead anyway. That's fine. No problem. All right. Kind of to set the stage for this and my approach in this talk, which is, I'm sure, different from much of what you're receiving, is this talk is basically a matter of looking for anomalies. As we all know, anyone who's researched the Kennedy assassination is quite familiar with the fact that we all look for anomalies. What was different? What happened that shouldn't have happened? What should have happened that didn't? Hundreds of people have pored over the response of the Secret Service, the protective action offered by the Secret Service, how well the Dallas police performed afterwards in controlling the crime scene, handling evidence. Hundreds more have looked into immense detail at activities in the autopsy of Bethesda. Again, looking for anomalies. What shouldn't have happened? What was standard practice? And what do we really see? In the hope that that will give us a clue as to any elements of conspiracy. Personally, if you've read Someone Would Have Talked, you know that I spent a considerable amount of time looking at the behavior and performance of Lyndon Johnson in the 3 months before the assassination and the 48 hours after the assassination and in the weeks immediately after the assassination, looking at his behavior. Was anything radically different? Is there anything suspicious? Anything that you wouldn't expect? So, in concept, this talk is just that. It's looking for anomalies. And my thought was, a lot of folks who believe in a larger conspiracy, a grander conspiracy, assume that there must have been a great deal of control after the fact. A lot of people involved or with knowledge, and so that's the question here. Basically, in looking at the national security response, do we find anomalies? Were people doing what they should be doing? And that's what we'll be looking at today. And it does have a lot of terminology that goes with it, which is why I'm fully prepared to stop at any point and take questions about this this activity, which is sort of uniquely American. You wouldn't find necessarily these procedures and protocols as a matter of British national security. Certainly, some of them are, but there are a lot of unique things going on with the American national security system, so that means some of the terminology may not be familiar. If we would go to the next slide, then, one of the starting points is, of course, to determine what really is involved in the national security response. What groups are there? What groups are supposed to be involved? What individuals are involved? What are their tasks, their functions, their duties? What should they be doing? And as we see, the first category, obviously the first category to talk about and to really get a good understanding of what they should have been doing would be the Secret Service. And most of us concentrate on the Secret Service before and during the assassination. Not much is made really in JFK literature of what they should be doing immediately after the shooting, for the next several hours, for the next day. And so stop for a minute and let's think of what they should be doing. One of their primary duties following any national event involving the president or the vice president is communications. If you study this, you know that the White House detail, in conjunction with the communications agency at the White House, go into extreme measures, and certainly in those days more extreme measures perhaps than we do today, because they didn't have access to digital communication, satellite communication, sat phones. They had to spend a lot of time moving around communications trailers, flying communications trailers in to locations where the president would be visiting. And the whole concept of this was that the president would have to have immediate access to a live operational telephone that would connect the president to not just the White House, but the National Military Command Center and the Strategic Air Command. The protocol for that was that anywhere the president was standing at any given time, he needed to be able to pick up a phone within 2 to 3 minutes and assume duties as Commander-in-Chief. And we see that in Dallas. They flew a communications trailer into Dallas in a transport plane. It was out at Love Field. It was fully staffed. And they had an extensive radio network going amongst the Secret Service throughout the motorcade. So this whole point is, was anything peculiar? Did that network get used the way it should have after the fact? Was the Secret Service in communications with the White House Situation Room as well as their own chain of command? Because it is up to the Secret Service to apprise essentially the national principals in command of security system about what's going on, and those people are really supposed to be available to the Situation Room. President Kennedy himself established the Situation Room just before the 1962 missile crisis and used it quite extensively. We'll get into that in a little bit as we review what should have been happening in the Situation Room, but a large extent of the Secret Service responsibility is to maintain situational awareness of what's happening to the president in any national emergency, what's happening to the vice president, and for that matter, what's happening to the people in the chain of succession to national command. They're also responsible for the post-attack protective response, both for the president and the vice president, which means these are the people that not only are supposed to do it themselves, but they are the people that are supposed to call on the military, call on the Air Force, call on the other assets available to provide presidential and vice presidential protection. And it's very interesting as we look across several national emergency events to see whether or not they actually do that. Another thing that just out of curiosity, Stuart, how many people in the room have heard of continuity of government? Something Peter Dale Scott writes a lot about recently.
Got
Not the
one,
phrase.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, probably a quarter of the room, just
Okay.
under.
It's kind of interesting because Peter has focused on that in a couple of his recent books and a lot of his talks. Continuity of government just simply represents the point that there are procedures and protocols in place so that if something happens to the commander-in-chief, something happens to the Secretary of Defense, there's a line of succession, and that line of succession involves moving personnel into emergency facilities, securing personnel, getting them into communications. Basically, it's a measure to ensure that there is no, what you would call, decapitation of the American government. And this, actually activating this and affecting a lot of it is the responsibility of the Secret Service, something that really doesn't get talked about a lot. Recently, in the past year, I had the opportunity to interview one of the individuals who was part of this system back in 1963 and talked to him about how continuity of government was activated. And he was very adamant that indeed it was activated in 1963. People started to be relocated. And the interesting thing is that it was activated by Mr. Rowley, the head of the Secret Service, which is not at all out of line because it is the Secret Service that makes sure that all of these people get into place and have security. They're the ones who are supposed to collect the Speaker of the House, who is third in succession to the presidency. So this is what the Secret Service should have been doing in 1963. And as we'll look over time, I'll look at the Reagan shooting, I'll look at 9/11, and we'll look at how the Secret Service performed on these other occasions to see if we find anything anomalous or out of line. Were they doing the right things in 1963, and did they do similar things on those other occasions? Another major element that's involved in this is the White House Situation Room. The Situation Room, as I said, was established by President Kennedy. It contains the core of communications within the White House and within the administration, any given administration. It's constantly manned 24/7. It has watch officers who are in communications instantly with similar watch centers, not only in the military, but in the FBI, the CIA, NSA. Basically, it's the responsibility of the White House watch to consolidate all that information, provide information back to those other locations, but have it on hand for the principals of the administration. And when I'm saying the principals, I'm talking about those people that are involved with national security. Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State. There are several, the people that meet as part of the National Security Council in any given administration. And I should also say that this is the place normally, unexpectedly, to find national command authority. I need to elaborate on that a little bit, but it's very important for the Situation Room to be in total communications with the individuals that constitute national command authority, which are the President and Secretary of Defense. Let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
So, in addition to the Secret Service and the White House Situation Room, what else goes on during any national crisis in the United States? Another major location that plays an important role is the National Military Command Center, which is located in the Pentagon. Again, it's set up to have absolutely essential communications with all branches of the military, all the services, all the active military commands, and this is where normally during any crisis the Secretary of Defense would be found. it's important to remember, and I know there's been a lot of talk over the years in the Kennedy assassination about what the Joint Chiefs were doing. Were they at the autopsy? Where was General LeMay? It's important to keep in mind that that's an interesting thing, but as of 1962, under orders within the Kennedy administration, the situation there was that the Joint Chiefs have no actual command authority. National Command Authority was then and is still now strictly resident with the President and the and the Secretary of Defense. If the President is not available, it's the Vice President. Vice President is not available, it's the Speaker of the House. These are the only people that have the ability to commit the American military to action overseas. The military can defend itself, however, it cannot be ordered to act other than by National Command Authority. So, literally speaking, the Joint Chiefs had no command authority in 1963. They existed at the Pentagon only to relay orders from the President and Secretary of Defense to their services. And the National Military Command Center's primary role is to communicate those orders to the different military commands and security agencies to make sure that the defense condition is communicated effectively and to send out alerts, emergency action messages which go to the nuclear commands, and to participate in activating the PSYOP as required. Now here's a new term, PSYOP, fascinating term which I write about extensively in Surprise Attack. It stands for the Single Integrated Operations Plan, which is kind of an innocuous term until you realize that this is the total nuclear response of the United States. The PSYOP is the plan for deploying and using nuclear weaponry among all the service. And at that time, that included not only the Air Force and the Navy, but the Army, and thousands of tactical nuclear warheads in Europe, a lot of nuclear weaponry in Britain. And those communications are coordinated through the National Military Command Center and the time through Army, Navy, and Air Force special communications channels. I'm kind of probably going on at length at this because I realize some people may not understand it, but it's very important if you're going to look back at these events over the decades and see how well the National Military Command Center functions. Just to make a couple of side remarks, a lot of you, if you follow American politics, may realize that there's been a huge political debate over the last few years over the role of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in regard to the attack in Benghazi. The fascinating thing about that is that virtually none of the people that talk about that realize that the Secretary of State has absolutely no authority, no resources, and no assets, and could not legally do anything in regard to an attack on an American embassy or consulate overseas under any circumstances. All that legal authority is contained in the National Command Authority and the various operating commands of the military. So it's fascinating to see and actually very embarrassing as an American citizen to realize how few commentators, press people, and congresspersons have any knowledge of how this sort of thing is supposed to operate even within my own country. Moving along, National Command Authority. National Command Authority gets to be really important when we talk about November 22nd, 1963, and comparing it to other points and other major crises for the country. As I said, National Command Authority constitutes the Commander-in-Chief, which is either the President or a successor, and the Secretary of Defense. National command authorities include ordering military action and, very importantly, rules of engagement. For those of you who have not been in the military, rules of engagement define essentially who you can shoot at and when you can shoot at them. Very important, if you don't have rules of engagement in place, even if you order the military to proceed, they don't necessarily know what to do. They may do the wrong thing, and more importantly, without any rules of engagement, they may freeze in place and not do anything at all, which is essentially what we saw on 9/11 in the United States. A major part of the failure of the American air defense on 9/11 in the United States was because there were no rules of engagement in place that covered it. The rules of engagement could only be set by our Secretary of Defense, and our Secretary of Defense was AWOL on 9/11. A harsh statement, but if you read Surprise Attack, I have no problem defending it. Other aspects of national command authority obviously are succession plan, the continuity of government, controlling the PSYOP, issuing changes in defense readiness condition, and authorizing military response. So I think I'll stop for a moment at this point. This may have been sort of boring for some folks who are not interested in crises, but it is for those of us who are, and see if there are any questions at this point.
Yeah, one, Larry, which probably takes us off the subject somewhat, but at lunchtime we were actually discussing Sarah Hughes, that rather dubious lady who was called by LBJ to Air Force One that day. If there was this